Games are really complex. They often have hundreds of moving parts that interact with each other in unpredictable ways. One way of coping with this complexity is called subtractive design. The idea is that you first throw a whole bunch of different ideas into your game just to see what sticks, and then you steadily subtract the ones that don't fit very well until you're left with a small, crystallized core where every element is important. The original Super Mario Bros. Is a good example of this. The game only has a dozen different enemies, but they're all instantly recognizable by their appearance and by their behavior. Keeping the total number of enemies low meant that each one could have its own artwork and code without making the game overly complex. This was especially important in the NES era because of the tiny amount of memory available to developers. Super Mario Bros. Checks in at just 31 kilobytes, which is far smaller than even this JPEG image of Waluigi. But what if you don't want to make a small, streamlined game? What if you want your game to have a wide variety of content and situations? Well, it turns out that there's another popular Nintendo game that we could learn from. For their time, Pokemon Red and Blue were absolutely jam-packed full of content. Despite running on the original Game Boy, which is pretty much a glorified calculator, they contained 151 unique kinds of Pokemon and a semi-open game world to catch them in. But there's a simple trick to how they squeezed in all of this content. Every Pokemon is actually cobbled together out of smaller pieces, like a Lego house, and by swapping out some of these pieces, you can create a unique new Pokemon while reusing most of your code. Think about this. It's essential that every Pokemon has specific strengths and weaknesses. If your Pokemon was a perfect all-rounder, you'd never need to capture any new ones, and that would defeat the whole point of the game. So to create these strengths and weaknesses, the devs drew up this elemental type chart. Using this one chart, you can work out how every move affects every Pokemon. There's 100 different possible interactions, which does make this type chart pretty complicated and hard to learn. But if the chart didn't exist, things would be way more complicated. You'd have to make a special rule for each possible interaction, like Thunderbolt is super effective against Magikarp, and Thunderbolt is super effective against Starmie, etc, etc. This list of rules would easily take up all the space on your cartridge and all the space in your player's brain. So it's much simpler to just say electric type is super effective against water type. Now we can take the typing of Thunderbolt and we can take the typing of Magikarp and we can plug them into the type chart to see how they interact. The point I'm trying to make here is that there is a separation between data and mechanics. Instead of linking one Pokemon directly to another, we first split each Pokemon into a handful of simple pieces, and then we write mechanics that link those pieces together. In other words, when you're in the middle of a Pokemon battle, you can actually kind of ignore the Pokemon themselves. Instead, you just need to know their type and their moves, and from that, you can work out what to do. Of course, Pokemon are more than just a type and some moves. They also have health and a status element, experience and stats, and their moves also have some extra data too, for power and accuracy, inflicting ailments and PP. And when you put all of that together, you get a table with about 15 different layers. Since there's so many different layers in this table, you can edit just a handful of them and you can end up with a mechanically different Pokemon. That's how they crammed so many Pokemon onto a tiny Game Boy cartridge, by filling out this table in 150 different ways. In fact, you can even see this table in-game by opening up your Pokemon's summary screen. Today, the series is approaching 1,000 unique Pokemon, each of which can interact with all of the others in countless different ways. They also have extra features now, like abilities and natures and held items, but the basic principle still holds just as much now as it did 25 years ago. The Pokemon are separated out into a bunch of different layers, and by tweaking the data in each layer, you can end up with a unique Pokemon. This way, the game supports a massive amount of content while still being simple enough for children to play, and crucially, simple enough for the developers to actually build. Here's another way to think about it. A Pokemon can be easily described using a table, as you've seen, but an enemy from Super Mario Bros. Doesn't fit onto a table so easily. Each enemy type has some special, unique behavior, which means that really you need a full paragraph to explain everything that it does. And it's therefore pretty likely that each enemy type has unique code. So basically, if a gameplay element fits easily onto a table, that content is layered. On the other hand, if it requires a long paragraph to describe, then that content is bespoke, meaning it was individually designed. Now, Pokemon makes really good use of layering its content, but a lot of other games actually do this too. Card games make heavy use of it, so let's consider some cards from Hearthstone, since it's one of the simpler card games out there. A Hearthstone minion has just 6 layers. Their class, cost, power, health, tribe, and text. By varying this data, you can create all of the crazy situations that turn up in a Hearthstone game. Except that's not quite true. I kind of cheated here. We can see that these first 5 layers are simple data fields, but this last layer is actually a paragraph. And so these cards are in fact a fusion of layered and bespoke design. In the abstract world of game design, we often want things to fit neatly into our boxes and our diagrams, cleanly separated from each other like sealed petri dishes. But the real world is messy. Categories have fuzzy edges where they bleed together, and some things defy categorization entirely. Personally, I think the theory is supposed to be a tool that helps you build, rather than a cage that stops you trying new ideas. So you can take a little bit of theory A and a little bit of theory B, and then you can blend it together with a few spicy ideas of your own. Of course, the key to this is managing your trade-offs, combining the advantages and the disadvantages of particular ideas so that the final product is better than the individual parts. And like everything else, layered design comes with its own set of trade-offs. It's great at creating huge amounts of content, like hundreds of unique Pokemon. And this content also works well with procedural generation, like the millions of unique customizable guns in Borderlands. But if you're not careful, that content can sometimes start to blur together, with each particular piece lacking its own clear individuality. On the other hand, bespoke design is great at creating highly original elements, but it can be hard to scale this up because you're essentially starting from scratch each time. You'll also need to hard code a lot of the interactions between these elements because they're all so different. And this can get hard to maintain as the game increases in complexity. If we wanted to massively oversimplify things, we could just say that it comes down to the age-old trade-off between quality and quantity. How much stuff can you make before you start repeating yourself? So that's why the hybrid approach of card games is so clever. For the most part, these cards are layered. Tazdingo is a neutral 4-cost 3/5, and Azure Drake is a neutral 5-cost 4/4 dragon, but their effect text then injects just enough bespoke design to make them feel fully distinct. Tazdingo can protect your other minions, and Azure Drake works well in a deck with lots of spells, or where you need to cycle through your cards quickly, or ideally both. And it's not like these card texts are 100% bespoke either. Most of them contain at least one keyword, written in bold. These keywords refer to mechanics rather than to bespoke rules, and you'll find them repeated across several cards, sometimes with a minor variation. So if you want to spice up your layered content, you can inject a little bit of bespoke behavior. And if you want to simplify your bespoke content, keeping it ordered and understandable, you can use keywords to share effects between multiple elements. I've been thinking about these concepts a lot over the past few years because I'm making a game of my own. It's an action roguelike, kind of like Enter the Gungeon, but with a twist. You have a lasso that lets you mount and ride every enemy in the game, and this lets you use their abilities in combat. This mechanic pushed me into a heavily layered design. There's a limited number of buttons on a gamepad, which means that the monster skills needed to map directly on top of the player skills. Of course, this also meant that every skill needs to be usable by both the player and the monsters. Shrub hogs can use the slash attack, and therefore the player can also use the slash attack if they're riding a shrub hog. Here's how layered design can solve this problem. For simplicity, I decided that every attack would be built out of projectiles, and these projectiles would have their own stats. They are owned by a character, they deal a certain amount of damage, and they can also inflict a particular ailment. On top of this, each projectile has its own movement pattern, and this is the bespoke part of the equation that helps the many different skills each feel more unique. Next, we need to add layers to our characters. They need some HP, and they need a status. The player can actually have 3 different stacking statuses, which is useful because there's also some positive statuses in the game like floating or invisible, but monsters only have 1 status to keep them simple. Finally, we define a mechanic that connects projectiles with characters. A projectile's damage can decrease the character's HP, and a projectile's ailment can replace the character's status. And putting it all together, we get this setup, which actually is a lot like the one I drew earlier for Pokemon attacks, only tweaked for an action game rather than a turn-based tactics game. With that, we can now give any skill to any character, and it'll work as expected. Of course, there's a limit to how far you can take this kind of symmetry. We want the monsters to feel unique and not just like clones of the player, and so I added some extra monster-only layers, which are shown here in red. The movement layer changes how that monster moves around. By default, monsters chase the player, but some monsters are evasive, and other monsters slide around in straight lines. And this starfish rolls around like a wheel. These movement effects don't override the player's motion, since that would be super annoying, but they make a big difference when applied to enemies because it changes how the player wants to dodge and aim. Each monster also comes in several variants. There's a swarm variant which has low HP but higher agility, and they tend to spawn in groups. And there's the jumbo variant which can fill the entire screen with their bullets. These variants have allowed me to reuse the same monsters but with some different stats, and again this changes how the player needs to react. On top of this, Elite and Jumbo variants can use a unique ability. Shrub Hog has the Thistle ability, which fires out a wave of spines, and these attacks stack on his other skills, making him extra aggressive. Other monsters have defensive skills. Copra is a snake with a long armoured tail, and Rolladillo has a spinning shell with only 1 opening you can shoot through. Some monsters have evasive skills. Triantula can zipline all over the room, leaving webs as it moves, and Magelian can disappear before summoning several shadow clones. These abilities are, of course, bespoke. I started pretty much from scratch for each monster, and this took a lot of time. But they're also the part that makes each monster feel unique and sells their theme, just like the effect text on a Hearthstone card, and so they were well worth adding. Now, game design theories can be fun to think about, and they can let you see old games in fresh ways. But at the end of the day, theories aren't much use unless they actually help you make better games. So, to wrap this video up, here's my take on why you should consider splitting a game's content into layers. 1. It can simplify your mechanics. Suppose your game has status ailments like in Final Fantasy, or suppose it has elemental resistances like in Pokemon. Here you can layer your content so that these mechanics apply equally to all the characters in your game. And this really helps your gameplay feel more consistent. Number 2, it's great for procedural generation. Since you've separated your content into data fields, it's pretty easy for a computer program to mutate those fields and come up with unique content variants. This is how the guns work in Borderlands, and how almost anything works in No Man's Sky. 3. It's great for symmetry. If you want a mechanic to affect both the player and the NPCs, then you can give them some shared layers. Then they become pretty much interchangeable in that context. Think about how in Pokemon, you can use your own captured Pokemon to fight another wild Pokemon. And I also use this in Patch Quest to let the player ride the enemy monsters and then use their skills. And, of course, there's also some situations where layering falls short. It's tricky to create memorable set pieces through layering, and so for these key moments in your game, you'll want to spend the extra time making something truly unique. Also, if you layer too much, it can make your gameplay start to blur together, and so it's a good idea to spice up each element with at least a little bit of bespoke flavor. Finally, we need to get down to business. The kind of business that ends friendships and splits families. Are you Team Grookey, Scorbunny, or Sobble? Personally, I'm Team Bulbasaur, ha! But yeah, let me know in the comment section below. I've got more videos very much like this one in the works, so if you want to see more, consider subbing and ringing the bell. And if you want to learn more about Patch Quest, you can check out some of my other videos on the channel. And there's also a free alpha that you can download. The links are in the doobly-doo. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching.